Phil Quirk, welcome to Focus on the Fun Stuff podcast.
Thank you very much, Em.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. I'm going to do my best to kind of cram in everything into my intro of all of the people and businesses that you support and help and everything you do. We've known each other for quite a long time now. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and that was actually for an NLP course, and you've worked with us at my PA on a human performance day together. But you are a human performance specialist. You're the founder of the Ether Principle as well, which I know we're going to dive into and what that's about. You're an author as well. And ultimately, as I understand, you help humans to be the best version of themselves. And you've done this you've worked with members of the special forces, high profile and very successful entrepreneurs and business owners, elite sports professionals as well. I know there's a lot you're going to have from your perspective in how to help business owners to focus on the fun stuff today. But I guess as a starting point, Phil, it would be really great if this interest that you've got in human performance, what triggered it and where it's come from and how it's evolved.
Yeah, I think if I think back, it probably started when I first joined the Marines, and I didn't realize it at the time because it was just an experience. But what was happening is through that experience, I was learning a lot about resilience, about mindset, about human performance. I was fairly unremarkable career in the Marines. I wasn't at all.
I feel like being in the Marines is remarkable enough.
Well, actually, I think you probably nailed it on the head. Like just doing it is a remarkable achievement. But amongst all of those other guys, I was not the fittest, not the strongest, didn't have the best mindset. I struggled through everything. I never really kind of was at one point thinking, I'm like one of the high achievers here. I was absolutely at the bottom. Right. When you add into that like a huge amount of imposter syndrome, I came from this tiny island on the Isle of Man, nobody had ever heard of. Anybody that had heard of it thought it was the Isle of Wight. So, I spent most of my time trying to explain even where I came from. And I had these guys around, that were from Liverpool, from Manchester, from London, from Glasgow, from these city areas. Yeah. And I'd actually never even been on a plane the first time I went to the Marines. I'd never been abroad.
Wow.
So I was in this massive world where I felt pretty out of my depth.
Yeah. So how old were you when you joined the Marines?
I was 19 when I joined. Okay. But I got, kind of, I don't think when you grow up in a poor background, you're ever aware of it. But, we didn't have holidays. We didn't really go away. Like I say, my first time on a plane was to go to the Marines. That's the first time I'd ever been on one. And the only holiday I can ever remember growing up was when we went to Pontins, which is for anyone that's grew up in the 80s or 90s will remember. But, I hadn't been abroad and I hadn't seen things. And it was a huge experience in seeing what this massive world was through these tiny eyes.
Yeah. And how long were you in the Marines for?
I did 6 years. I knew straight away that there's a famous saying in the Royal Marines that anyone can be a Marine, but not everyone can be a bootneck. And what that means is joining the Marines and becoming a Royal Marine is one thing, but really kind of those natural soldiers, those bootnecks, those ones that live for it and they want to stay in as long as their career lasts. That was never really me. I knew pretty early on I was a little bit of a square peg in a round hole. And as much as I loved being in the Marines and I loved the camaraderie, I learned so much about resilience just by the product of what we did.
Yeah.
I learned so much about culture, high performance culture. I didn't know at the time I was going to go into this professionally, but I was kind of getting educated without even realizing I was getting educated. So I only actually did 6 years.
Okay. Yeah. And so this was ultimately the kickstart to you realizing the impact, I guess, high performance, resilience, all of this has on your life and businesses and organizations.
Yeah. So
when you left the Marines, where were you intending to go next? What was the trajectory?
Good question, actually. So when I left the Marines, not many people know this. I was quite a good DJ when I was growing up, when I was a kid, and I'd come second in this huge competition whilst I was in the Marines. It was like a worldwide competition. So the reason why I left the Marines was to pursue this dream of being a DJ, which never really worked out. I mean, I grew a Mohican and went to Ibiza a lot, but I never really had any success. And after a couple of years of really trying and having a really good time DJing, and certainly I probably like reliving my youth a little bit because I joined the Marines at such a young age. I was kind of in my mid-20s, kind of recapturing that Ibiza youth that perhaps the 19-year-old me would have done. But eventually I decided to join the RAF, and that was probably the pivotal moment for me, because initially I went into the RAF as a physical training instructor, but then my passion for mindset and human performance was triggered really by just a number of influential people. I'd always believed that I wasn't a very intelligent person. I'd kind of had that label at school of being sporty but not academic. Right. And I'd worn that label pretty proudly most of my adult life. You know, I joined the Marines because I thought, give me a Bergen, give me a gun, I'll run around. But there was no kind of academic reading or that sort of side of me was certainly dormant. And there was a guy that I was in the RAF with that he must have saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. And he encouraged me to start reading. And I remember the book that he first gave me was The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. And I read that and I was fascinated. It was just absolutely fascinating. Just wasn't like anything I'd read at school. Like when you're at school, you have to read like stuff like Shakespeare, and that didn't really interest me. But what did interest me was, how people thought, how people behaved, how some people are really successful, others aren't. What are the things that separate those two categories? And once that light had been switched on, that was it. Then I was away, and that was the start of everything for me, which was probably about 2008, 2009.
It's interesting, isn't it? Why don't we do those books at school? Why do they never give us anything that's actually like self-development or personal development? It's super interesting, isn't it?
I don't know, but I say to my daughter now that, say to both my daughters, but my oldest one is kind of 15 now, and I say to her, being able to communicate really effectively, and you'll know this from what you do with my PA for sure, is going to be like a gold rush in the future, because those younger generations that have come through with that digital development, if you're a young person that can really communicate in a super effective way, I think regardless of perhaps if you don't get a maths GCSE or, a science GCSE, I think you'll accelerate in the future. And certainly with her, I encourage wherever I can to read about these type of self-development and improvement books. Yeah,
totally agree. So in the RAF then, you were a physical trainer.
Yes.
And so how long did you stay there for?
Did 6.
So another 6 years.
Yeah, so like half rice, half chips. Sort of. So exactly the same time, 6 years in the Marines, 6 years in the RAF. The Marines was much more of an experiential experience. And I think I developed my character a little bit in the Marines. I think I did. But my intellect was then shaped by the RAF. And that's where I kind of added what I did in the Marines and combined it with the opportunities that were there in the RAF, which were huge, much better than the Marines in terms of the courses that I could go on, the things that I could learn, my start in NLP was in the RAF. My start my journey into hypnosis was in the RAF. Human performance, positive psychology, all these things, transactional analysis. I just was able to have this massive experience of learning, and the RAF was incredible for that. It really was.
And so when you left the RAF, was this then about strengthening your NLP skills? Because I know you became an NLP trainer as well. Is that what you did from leaving the RAF? I'm going to go into a human performance exploration role.
Yes, pretty much. Yeah, initially we were actually targeting in my first business the oil and gas industry in Aberdeen, but pivot's such an overused word, I think, in the business world, but it's such an important word to understand. As we were going into the oil and gas, the kind of oil price fell at the end of 2014. I'm not sure if you remember that far back, but oil collapsed. The price of oil went through the sort of floor. And what happened there is all of the opportunities that were kind of bursting in 1 month, almost in Aberdeen, were almost like closing down in front of our eyes right when we were launching the business.
Right.
So we pivoted really quickly and started looking at the financial sector and doing the same thing, human factors, human performance. But instead of kind of looking at trying to deliver it in Aberdeen with oil and gas, it was almost, can we use these same ideas and these same models and concepts? And the answer was yes. We won a contract with Barclays. Once you've got a contract with Barclays, you know, you've got your blue chip client.
Yeah.
And that was really the start of the momentum.
How amazing. So, I mean, I know that it will have evolved, but ultimately, like at this point, how are you supporting businesses and teams, and what was the original business about?
I think primarily leadership's a big part of what we do. We provide training, consultancy, in and around the topics of leadership, of resilience, of human performance. Culture is a big thing that we do. We did a wonderful piece of work with an NHS trust over a really long period of time, sort of 3.5 years of working to try and improve their culture significantly. And culture is that really interesting topic where it's such a kind of slippery fish. You know, it's almost indescribable. It's how we do stuff. I was actually having a conversation only this week about the work that I've just returned from with UK ISAR, so the United Kingdom International Search and Rescue. If I could bottle their culture, if I could find a way of just encapsulating how they perform as a team.
Oh, really? And
then find a way to be able to share that with like corporate clients that are always desiring this high performance culture. You know, I'd be. How
interesting. And why? What are the key things that you would bottle that they have?
Do you know what? That's a really great question, because I've thought about it since 2017. I've worked with them nearly every January for the last 5 or 6 years. The first 2 were biannually, and then it's been annually since then. And obviously we missed one with COVID. The purpose is a massive thing. So like they have this huge amount of purpose with what they do. There's a huge amount of self-selection. So they don't get paid any extra money. So they're firemen, they're specialist firemen. So they're part of what's called USAR, which is Urban Search and Rescue.
So who, is it a private organisation, or how is it funded? Who?
No, it's public. So it's part of the fire service.
Right. Okay.
So what the fire service have is they obviously have firemen and firewomen, and they are frontline fire service. Part of that, they have something called USAR, which is Urban Search and Rescue, and to become part of ISAR, who I work with, which is International Search and Rescue, they have to first be part of USAR, and then they have to apply. And the application process, they take the kind of very best. And because they don't necessarily earn any more money from it, there's almost like a self-selection where they're getting the right type of people.
Right, because they just really want to do it.
Yeah, and so that's a big part of it. It's not a financial reward that they're working for. They have this huge amount of identity around what they do, which I think is an incredible ingredient in culture. Purpose and identity. What is our purpose as a team? What do we do? Their purpose is, when there's a natural disaster in the world, they're the guys that the men and women that get sent straight away. So the team a couple of years ago went straight from us in Sweden straight to Turkey for the earthquake. They've attended Fukushima, Christchurch, Haiti. And this all came about from when they went to Kathmandu in 2015, I think it was, the Nepalese earthquake, and realized that they needed to do a little bit more winter-specific training. But their culture is the highest performing culture that I've ever seen.
Really?
Bar none, bar elite sport. Even I would go so far to say any Royal Marines or Special Forces or any military that I've seen, these UK ISAR are cut above.
Really? It's so interesting, isn't it? In the very first episode that I did of Focus on the Fun Stuff, Vikash Shah, he was talking about charities and how he thinks that in a similar way, business can learn so much from charities because their ability to, one, use resource really well when they've got limited resources, but two, like the way that they really get behind a cause, a mission, it makes everything else flow so much more easily because they're all like so cohesive. I guess it's like a similar kind of thing in that what they're doing and why is so strong. And I probably think that, I know that we've had challenges with it. Like lots of businesses actually just struggle to really concisely get what are we about? What's our mission? Who are we really helping? Isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it was Viktor Frankl that wrote about something similar to that in his book Man's Search for Meaning, where he talked about when a person has a why, they'll overcome any what. And when that why is so powerful, whether that be a charity, whether that be a public service body, which is why you get such amazing microcultures, within any public body service. So you look at nurses within the NHS and how hard they work. And then you look at, military guys that go to Afghanistan and Iraq and they spend 6 months in the most unimaginable, difficult conditions, challenging conditions, not that great pay, and they work, unbelievable as a team and are prepared to sacrifice, for the person next to them and give everything up. So there's these kind of examples of this amazing this self-sacrificing culture that kind of grows from these bodies where money isn't the defining factor. And I think that's a big part of this, that if you look at all of those things, whether it's charity, NHS, military, the money is not the driving factor. And I think the moment that money becomes the kind of hierarchical gradient of your true north within an organization, I want to get promoted because I want to get paid more and then I want to get bigger bonuses, then a little bit of that I'll do anything for the guys around me gets lost perhaps.
Yeah, totally. So how do you practically help businesses then with that that problem of harnessing the team, the culture, like is just also for the people listening to this as well, because I know especially like lots of small business owners struggle with that, like how we get everyone, what I see as the founder, that I know what we're doing, I know it's important, but how do I translate that? How do you then go into businesses and help them with that?
I think primarily there's a great model that you can use, which we use within a lot of what we do. It's called Lencioni's. It's actually called the Dysfunctions of a Team, but the reason for that was because it's based on the book, which was given the title Dysfunctions because it sells better than functions. A negatively titled book, the same as a negative headline in a paper, sells better than a positive headline. But effectively, it's very simple, very difficult to execute, but very simple to understand. Any high-performing team is built on a foundation of trust, absolute trust. And trust is something that can take a long time to develop, and you can lose it really quickly. It's wrapped in transparency. It's wrapped in great communication. There's a myriad of things that come out of trust, which you can then start to sort of condense down into how do we actually do it? Do we have real transparency? Do we have real clear communication? Do we follow through with what we say? Do we keep to our word? Do we have a culture where if I say something as the leader of a business, then my people know that that's the way it's going to happen and they trust me in that? Or do I say stuff and people go, well, actually, this is going to be changed next week. Yeah. So trust is the underpinning foundation. And if you've got the right level of trust, what you can then have is you can have conflict, and conflict sometimes seen as a negative thing in business, but actually it's only really negative if there's a lack of trust, because then conflict's perceived as politics and gender-based. But if you've got high levels of trust, say, for instance, we work together, we both absolutely trust each other, we can really, really have what I call positive conflict. My favorite phrase is irritated oysters make pearls. And in business, you need conflict.
Oh, great.
You really, really need people to like get sometimes butt heads, but with the right trust and the right understanding between those people that they're doing it because they want to push the performance. So if you've got those two levels, so you've got the right level of trust, you can have real robust positive conflict, then you actually get commitment. In a dysfunctional team, you get what's called artificial harmony. People just passively pretend to get on board with ideas, but they're not really behind it. Primarily because there's a little bit of lack of trust. Primarily because of that lack of trust, they haven't been able to say what they really think because they haven't had that positive conflict. So the commitment levels aren't correct. And then if you don't have the right commitment levels, you'll have a lack of accountability. People will avoid accountability at all costs in a dysfunctional team. They'll embrace accountability all the time in a functional team. And if all those 4 levels are in place, then the results is the top of the pyramid. Dysfunctionally, it's a lack of results. Functionally, it's high performance. It's easy to talk about and it's easy to kind of encapsulate.
Yeah.
Sometimes can be very challenging within organizations, primarily probably because of trust is the biggest problem. It's the biggest barrier.
Yeah. And it can be I guess if you're lacking at any one of those levels, it can be a slow burn, a longer journey to start to turn that around. It's not an overnight fix, is it, ultimately? To all of a sudden get trust with everyone or...
No. And I think, it can be a little bit snakes and ladders where you kind of think you're making loads of progress and then you go back down to where you started. But once again, if you look at those examples that we've given, UK ISAR, nurses, military, the one thing that they have is huge levels of trust between each other. The person stood next to each other. Not necessarily maybe like the politics. So, with the military, with the NHS, maybe with any public service, there's not necessarily that trust at the higher levels, but the trust that the kind of the guy or the woman that's to my right or left
the team
is so high. That's where they cultivate this high performance. And that's the key for businesses. How do we foster a culture of trust within our organization where from the very start, from the very micro culture to when we start to scale up and it goes into a macro culture, we can maintain this. This is just the way we do it around here. We have trust. We trust each other. We're very transparent. We don't hide things. And if we can do that, the other levels are a lot easier to build.
Yeah. And I know that within your business, which is Limitless, isn't it? That's the one that supports business owners.
Yeah.
I know you do things like trips away where leadership teams will spend time together, maybe in more challenging environments and things. And then, but can you also support a team within their 4 walls? Like, will you go into businesses as well?
Yeah. I mean, we do a lot of work. Most of our work is within businesses. The trips away is actually more the charity work that does, which is Expedition Limitless. And the reason for that came about because what we wanted to do is we wanted to be able to demonstrate what we teach as a theory in classrooms. But this is what it really looks like. This is how you take a team of complete novices that they've never been to the Arctic. For most of the guys that went on the 23 expedition to the Arctic or the 24 expedition to the Yukon, they've probably never done anything that adventurous for most of them. So our statement was, rather than teach the theory, what we'll do is we'll do a charity expedition once a year. We'll raise an incredible amount for charity, which we do. But the byproduct of that is it enables us to be able to say, well, actually, we don't just talk the talk in classroom. We walk the walk. This is how you bring a team together. This is how you ingrain trust. This is how you build the Lencioni model. This is how you reveal resilience. Because I'm a huge believer that I do not subscribe to the modern belief that we're creating generations which aren't as resilient as the ones that have come before.
Oh, really?
No. Evolution doesn't work like that. We don't just undo evolution in a generation. Because resilience is innate. It's within all of us. And most people know this. People that perhaps that have never been physically fit, and their perception is, I can't get fit. It might be kind of like overweight or whatever. And then they start going to the gym and they start realizing actually they can get fit, and they start to reveal this physical fitness, which was always innate. It was always there. The fitness was always laid inside the person. They just become dormant and too comfortable. Now, I believe resilience is the same. It sits within everyone. But because we have such a comfortable modern life, because we've got so much comfort, we almost have made a world which is too successful. The modern world is too successful. Our children don't experience discomfort. They don't experience adversity. They don't perhaps experience what we might have done in the 80s and 90s because we've solved all the problems of those decades.
Right, yeah.
And the expedition was this idea that we could take people that perhaps didn't think they were resilient, that hadn't done any adventure, that were complete novices. And what we would do is we would show, actually, they can go and do these things. And so far, it's resoundingly successful. We had a young woman, as an example, an incredible young woman called Shannon, who had a really difficult upbringing. Her mum had lots of mental health challenges. She was bipolar. She talks about it very openly, Shannon, on podcasts. Her mum also was an alcoholic when she was growing up, and she became a carer at the age of 12, 13 years old. And the byproduct of that was she developed her own mental health challenges, anxiety and things like that, as she started to develop. And she came on the expedition. She's amazing. She's tiny. She's like beneath 5'4". I think she is anyway. She'll go mad if she is this and she isn't. I call her the pocket rocket. She's just an absolute ball of energy. She's a personal trainer. But she had a lot of challenges herself. And then she came to the Arctic. She did this huge expedition in the Arctic with us. And at the end of it, I talk about it being a tide mark. Her resilience tide mark had changed completely. Her perception of what she could do and what she couldn't do changed completely. Her realization that her mind was a filter for the world around. She could filter that world with her own practice and training and daily habits. And now she's doing incredibly well.
Really? I think that like your comment there around resilience would open a real can of worms for lots of business owners, because I know, God, I've been in rooms this week where everybody's talking about how younger people are not as the work ethic's disappearing, and that I guess like COVID had an impact on a certain age group that was staying at home. But I totally get your point that those things have never moved away from us internally. So is it more, do you think, I guess two questions, is it more a mindset perspective that's the problem at the moment? And my second question is going to be, is there any like key things, maybe it's the daily habits, is there any key things that you support businesses with to help workforces? I guess make more of their opportunity, like their own performance and what's possible.
Yeah, and it is a huge problem. There's no getting away that resilience in young people is a hot topic. And my belief is probably very different to what the common belief is, but common beliefs often shaped by opinion rather than fact. And one of the things that we should be taking responsibility for, as in my generation, is that the reason why young people are the way they are is a consequence of the way we've been we've got to take a little bit of responsibility from a parenting perspective. Our desire to make the lives of our children comfortable has the consequence of what we're seeing now in the workplace. And that can be undone. It is daily habits. Mental fitness and resilience is exactly the same as physical fitness and resilience, and it should be separated from mental illness, the same as physical fitness is separated from actual illness.
Yeah, okay.
So
interesting.
Those things aren't the same.
Yeah.
So mental fitness and mental health is the consequence of your daily habits.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean that some people won't develop mental illness. Of course, that's the case.
Yeah.
And they have to be given the appropriate support and care. But what we're doing is we're kind of talking about it all as if it's the same thing. And actually, most people that struggle, they struggle because of their daily habits. And that's really uncomfortable for people. They don't get the correct sleep. They perhaps drink too much alcohol. They don't exercise enough.
Yeah.
They don't have a good diet. And the consequence of all of those habits is your mental health. It starts to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
So what we've got to start doing is educating people on the importance of habits, daily habits. You're a consequence and the culmination of those daily habits. You do the right things in succession over a long period of time, and you reap the rewards in the same way that if you go to the gym and you eat well and you do that consistently over a period of time, after a few months, you go, God, I start to feel really great. I feel really fit. Your mind is exactly the same. It's exactly the same.
I so agree. And I think it's really important to just make it really clear, like what you're talking about there. It's not, I don't know, learning a new skill or having to do a really high impact gym class every day. Like most of that is actually just movement, isn't it? And maybe like listening to something, personal development, and drinking enough water. And I'm obsessed with Brendan Bouchard. He's a high performance coach in the US, and he has a phrase which always makes me, when I'm having a not so good day, I'm like, oh, he's right. And he always says that your mood today is affected by what you did 72 hours ago. So if you had the big night out, or if you had the junk food, or if you just decided to sack off the gym that day and did nothing, and it's so true. Like, you're so in control of your own mindset and outlook, aren't you? Just by very simple things that cost nothing, but just making sure that you do them daily.
100%. And the real crazy thing about this whole situation is none of these habits take long at all. Even when I present on this, we talk about there's some key habits that you can incorporate that will, if you do them consecutively, have a compound effect, compound interest. And some of them give you back time. Like quality sleep probably being the number one thing. Most people don't realize that sleep has such an integral part to your connection to your well-being. Yeah. When you get great sleep, you feel great. And the reason for that is that when you get really good quality sleep, you have the full circadian rhythm, you have all of the different stages that you need, which is prevented and interrupted with alcohol in your system, unfortunately. So when we drink, it's not necessarily the alcohol that's so much the problem, it's what the alcohol does to our sleep quality. And then obviously, like you say, for the next couple of days, you have the sort of brain fog. So some habits, they're completely passive to time. They don't, like deciding for what I'm going to do for the next 3 weeks. I'm just not going to have anything to drink, or the next month, which is what we do on a 28-day resilience challenge. So I'm not going to drink for 28 days. I'm just going to see how that affects my sleep and my mood. By about 7 to 10 days in, people cannot believe the effect it has on their sleep.
Really?
It's such a huge factor. And I don't, it's not that I advocate for people to be teetotal. I like to drink myself. I like to have a glass of wine, I like to have beer, but I also know the science. I also understand that if I do drink, then I can't really complain 2 days later that I'm a bit moody and I'm low on energy, because that will be a consequence of, like what Brendan says, what I did 72 hours ago, which affected it. So a lot of them are simple habits.
Totally. So just having a peek into the resilience challenge that you talked about.
Yeah.
So do you do that with groups, business owners?
Yes. Yeah.
And is it literally so many steps to follow? Can you just tell us a little bit more about what you generally include in the resilience challenge?
It's a 2.5-hour workshop. The workshop, in all honesty, is a sales pitch where I try and sell the idea of these habits.
That's like a good sales pitch, though.
Yeah. But I sell it with science. And then they get a workbook as part of it, which has daily logs. We did think about making it into an app, but the resounding feedback we've had and there's thousands of people that have been through it, is that there's a huge amount from the kind of pen and paper experience, especially with younger generations, because I think the research is pretty compelling that, most people don't use the apps on their phone. So making an app for something like this doesn't really solve it, contributes to the problem. So we kept it as they get a little sort of 28-day diary, and on there they do a little bit of journaling, but I explain the science, why journaling is good. I explain how your RAS works in your brain, which is something called your reticular activating system, and how your brain works a little bit like Google in so much it has a browser history. And, if you start to practice, you start to journal 2 or 3 positive things that happen each day, after a few weeks, your brain starts to look for things to be positive for. People start with the most obvious. I've got grateful. I've got a house. Grateful. My wife and my daughters. I'm grateful for their health. And you start with these kind of really obvious sort of bigger things. But after 10 days, 2 weeks, they become a lot more subtle, a lot less obvious. And by the end of it, there's much smaller things, like just someone opening a door, and you say thank you, and you have a little interchange, and then you remember that day that you put that down in your gratitude log. But what you're doing with that is you're training your brain to look for things to be grateful for. So that's in there. Which is a very interesting discussion with the group when we do it. we get them to share at the end of each day the positive thing that happened that day, as opposed to kind of sharing the worst thing that happened, which is what most people do.
Yeah.
Especially, dare I say it, as a generalization, our British culture.
Yeah.
What you tend to find is that at the end of each day, you share the worst thing that happened that day, and then you get into what I call the competition of shitness with your partner, where they share the worst thing, and before now you're reliving those worst things that experienced that day. So we just ask people for 28 days that when they go home, just to share something positive rather than something negative. So once again, takes no time. We encourage people to drink 2.5 to 3 liters of water per day. And to kind of track that, cut out alcohol for 28 days, which has the reason for the alcohol is because to improve the quality of sleep. We get them to do cold showers, which is always an interesting, and then a little bit of breath work to control their state. So when they feel stressed, just very basic box breathing or double exhalation to inhalation, just so they can have some sort of nervous system management. They do that for 28 days, and at the end of the 28 days, they report on how they feel. What we find unanimously is we haven't had anyone that's completed the 28 days that hasn't said it's a positive thing. Difficult to get people to actually do it, because I kind of work on it. If I have 100 people in the class, in the seminar, 50 won't start it, 50 will, and of that 50, 25 will finish. So you've got like a 25%. What we hope is that those 25 have such a positive experience, they kind of become innovators for the others, and the others jump back on. But it works. It works.
Yeah.
It absolutely works.
Totally. I really hope that anyone listening that's maybe not feeling absolutely jumping for joy and just feeling a bit off, right, really listens to that and starts to give it a try, because, I think you've already just articulated really clearly that a lot of this is, obviously people do get ill, but a lot of this is in our control, isn't it, of how our mood, our mindset, whether it's going to be a good day or a bad day or not. And we haven't really talked about journaling yet on this podcast. And I just want to make it really clear that anybody who hasn't done it, it doesn't have to be a big overwhelming thing, doesn't it, of writing in my diary, and just that strategy that you use there about just 3 good things that have happened today. Yeah.
And I think it's really important that you discuss the science with people for that. And I think that helps people to understand. So it's rather than just say, journal or do a gratitude journal, but then not tell them what is the purpose of that? What's the science there? And it is to do with, training your brain.
Right.
It is to do with, the best way that I can describe it is your brain works a little bit like Google in so much it has a browser history. So if you decide to buy a new car and you do a load of research, you start to notice those cars. And that's because it's in your browser history. You don't notice the other cars, but if it's the same one that you've just bought, which is why most people have had that experience, couples that decide to have a baby, they start to notice more pregnant women. Yeah. And it's to do with how your RAS works. So practicing gratitude is a way of controlling what your browser history is like by putting positive things into that browser history. So your brain, in a similar way to the pregnant women or the cars, it starts to notice things that perhaps it wouldn't have noticed if it wasn't in that browser history. So it's a conscious effort to kind of influence your subconscious filtering. It doesn't solve everything, but what it does do is it gives you a much better baseline to work from. And I think it's really important when you're discussing these habits, it's not enough to say, do this because it's a good idea. I think you've got to be able to do this because this is how it works and this is what you'll find and this is what you'll get from it.
Yeah.
It's a much more compelling sell then, I think.
Yeah, totally. And just to add to that as well, the thing that I've found is really good as you get into a flow of journaling is just having that. Sometimes I look back to say June last year and when I read my entries, I forgot about that. Actually, that was, I think because we're so we're pushing forwards, time's going so quickly and you kind of, I know I do, I can almost just only focus on what am I doing next? What am I achieving next? What's the next goal rather than also just bedding in great things that have happened. And I don't mean big things. I just mean a nice moment with someone or, something very simple.
Yeah.
And that backlog, I'm so grateful that I've got it recorded. I think it's a really nice thing to be able to look back on too.
Yeah. And reflection is such an important thing. And it's something that I think you've described quite elegantly that we're kind of losing in the modern world because we're so focused on what's happening next. You know, everybody's got that busy badge on, haven't they? Everyone is kind of trying to squeeze as much as they can out of every sort of. And actually what we don't do, myself included, is look back and go, oh, you know, that was really cool. But even if you think that's like the highlights, but if you've got a log, it's not even the massive highlights, the kind of episodic events. It's actually the small things that are day to day, which are probably even more important.
Absolutely.
And to have that reflection going backwards that you can kind of just look back through every now and then is phenomenal.
Yeah, no, I highly recommend journaling. Just 5 minutes, keep it simple, but the marginal gains, the compound effect of it is great.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about the ether principle. Yeah,
so as you mentioned, I've been teaching NLP for a long, long time, and I'm hugely passionate about it. But what I've become quite restless in the last few years, since just before COVID, really. And what triggered it was breath work. I got into breath work in 2016 or 17.
Oh, wow. So quite an early adopter then. It's like, it's cool now, isn't it? But everybody's like doing it in some way, shape or form. But
well, I'll tell you, so as a side story, this is a true story. I think it was 2018, I lived just outside Ironbridge in Shropshire.
Right.
And there's a river that runs through Ironbridge. And obviously I was really into breath work, really into cold stuff. Like many people, it was, you know, the Wim Hof method that introduced me to it. I found Wim just by accident on YouTube. Had a go at his breathwork technique. It kind of blew my mind completely. And Wim was, you know, making all of these claims about being buried in ice and climbing mountains. And because I'd come from that world in the RAF as an adventure training instructor, I didn't believe any of it. So I was like, that doesn't make any sense. You can't climb up Everest into the death zone in a pair of shorts and not like die. That just doesn't happen. You can't bury yourself up to your neck in ice for 2 hours and not get hypothermia. That just doesn't happen. But then it turned out he was doing these things, which really blew my mind. And what I really loved about his message was he was saying that he wasn't a Superman. It wasn't that he had some sort of special power. He was doing these things because he was doing this, practicing this breath work and practicing mindset and gradual non-forced cold exposure. So I started getting into the cold water stuff, and I'm down in Ironbridge, and I'm in the river. It's like December or January, I think 2017 or 18, just before COVID. And someone must have walked past and basically thought I was trying to finish it for myself. Death by sort of dunking cold water. And they rang the police. The police rang Mountain Rescue.
No.
And next minute I had, no joke, 3 police cars and a mountain rescue car all arrive on the scene.
Oh my God.
I'd got out by this point, so I'm toweling down. And they were, and I didn't realize they were there for me. They come running down. and I said to the policewoman, I said, well, what? There was a woman it was, and I said, what? Why? So somebody's obviously rang you, which I totally appreciate their concern, but why would they not just shout down to me, am I okay? Are you okay? But it shows you where we are now, that it's such a common thing for people to be in cold water, in the sea and in the river, that nobody would look twice at. So the ether principle started a little bit with me getting into breath work, and the actual origin of it was very simple. I'd been teaching hypnosis for a long time. I'd been studying and practicing it for even longer. And I'd observationally noticed that whenever I hypnotized someone as one of the clients I worked with, even if it was individuals or groups on a course, that without any suggestion or direction from me, their breath would change and they would start to breathe much more slowly and with a much deeper sort of profound breath profile, a real kind of deep, slow breath in and out. A little bit like when you're asleep, it's a different breath profile to when you're awake. And I kind of wondered, well, I'm not telling them to do that. So the ether principle was this idea that if someone goes into hypnosis and their breath changes, could you do it the other way around and do breath work first and then that leads into hypnosis? And the answer is absolutely yes. And really quite profoundly as well. So we started using breath work as a kind of an induction window to go into hypnosis.
Right.
And what we found from that was that we were able to access incredible depths of hypnosis. Depths being obviously a kind of subjective perception. There's no actual depth of hypnosis. It's a kind of a metaphorical depth, if that makes sense. So myself and another guy called Madi Hamidi, who was actually one of WIM's senior instructors, we started to come together in Barcelona, in Ibiza. He would come on my NLP courses. So we started to learn NLP and hypnosis from me. And I learned more from him in terms of breath work. We actually met studying breath work with a guy called Stig Sverrensen, who's a world freediving champion who come up with this concept called breathology. So me and Maddie we were studying under Stig. And we kind of came together and thought, well, actually, we think we've got something with this. When I met Maddie, it was kind of funny because we're doing this online training. It was all online because it was during COVID with Stig. And I think I kept annoying Stig a little bit because I kept asking him questions about hypnosis and biology and like I wanted to know the science behind how somehow breathwork was somewhat connected to hypnosis. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he knew the answers. I think he got annoyed with me asking him all the time. But Maddie was fascinated by it. Right. And we kind of connected offline. And that's where the ether principle started. It was this idea that could breathwork lead you into this incredible like reservoir of hypnosis? And once again, the answer was so profoundly yes. It was quite mind-blowing.
And for lots of people who won't have experienced it, so leading into the hypnosis, like what is the impact, the benefit, the point of that?
Well, that I think that was the point. Quite in an interesting way, was that Maddie was coming to this with breathwork was amazing as an experience, but it had no direction to it. It was almost like you just let people experience the breathwork, right, and they experienced it. Well, what hypnosis provided was a real purpose and a direction. So if you brought the two together and you said, well, actually, should we lead in with the breathwork into the experience? And then once the person's in the experience of the breathwork, without skipping a heartbeat, it's such a natural progression. We just go straight into the hypnosis within the breathwork. Mm. And you can do that one-to-one. You can do that one-to-group. We've been doing it online. And so now we can use all of these great techniques from hypnosis, things like emotional detoxes, things like control room. You know, as an example, there was a woman out in Ibiza with me, a wonderful woman called Leah who had lost 70% of her hearing through COVID. And I'd done a lot of work with hypnosis with restoring smell and taste after COVID. Kind of like 25 out of 26 people it worked with, immediately worked with straight back to how it was. And on the course, she said, well, could it work for hearing? She'd actually lost smell, taste and hearing in COVID. Her smell and her taste returned like 2 years later, but it was 4 years. This was obviously 4 years later. She still had 30% hearing only in one ear. And it's important to say that if that hearing loss had been hearing damage, for instance, she'd been, in a band and sort of next to a speaker, and
right,
then there's nothing hypnosis can do. But because it was hearing loss as a consequence of COVID, we thought, well, we can try. The only thing that would happen is if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. She's no worse off. And her hearing returned and it was an incredible thing to be part of. It was very emotional in the room.
Gosh.
She got emotional. She freaked out a little bit to begin with.
Yeah.
Because it was
a shock. I'm sure.
Imagine having 4 years of 30% hearing and then it pops.
Yeah.
So the techniques that are already established within hypnosis, what we've done is we've brought them together with breath work. And like I say, some of the results are remarkable.
Wow. And so is this a stupid question, but as hypnosis, is it similar in terms of the states that you might go into if, like, say, you do meditation?
Yes.
Or is it like a similar kind of...
Yes, it is. There's some real misperceptions around hypnosis, and primarily films and TV and all of those things. Hypnosis isn't a state of relaxation. It's actually a state of hyper focus and attention. Right. You do have physical relaxation, which is where there's a sort of a paradox there. But there's a kind of real physical relaxation of the person, similar to what you achieve within breath work. but the actual focus and attention is heightened a little bit like when you meditate. The idea is that you take this pure focus and attention, and this person goes inside themselves in this focus of attention, and with that you can affect some wonderful change. And the great thing is it's non-medicated, non-intrusive, and it's the person that makes all the changes. Me as the person that's facilitating the hypnosis or the breath work or the ether principle, whatever that is, you're really just like a guide more than anything. You're just helping them to get to where they need to get to so they can make their changes, which is very self-empowering for people to be able to take charge of them, some of the things that have been challenging them perhaps.
Yeah, totally. And just in terms of this podcast, so focus on the fun stuff, and it's primarily about business owners, I guess, enjoying the journey more. And I do think a massive part of that is everything we've talked about here. So like your mindset, your mood, treating your body well.
Yep.
So just on this breathwork meditation piece, because I feel like it's very, lots of people are aware of it now. I don't think there's still lots of people practicing it, and they think it's a bit woo-woo. Or I guess is there any kind of implementable, like if there was a business owner listening to this that is definitely overwhelmed, stressed, like some simple, whether it's the breath work or the meditation, that they could take away and do?
Yeah, so very simply, all stress is when your nervous system leaves homeostasis and goes into its sympathetic state. So you've got an autonomic nervous system which has really two functions. It has a sympathetic function, which is where everything speeds up, heart rate increases, body temperature goes up, respiratory rate increases, circulation goes up. All those things kind of increase in that sympathetic state. And then you've got a parasympathetic state, which is where everything slows down.
Right.
So what a lot of people don't realize is stress is not necessarily a bad thing. We need stress. It gets given a bit of a bad reputation. If you went on a treadmill in the gym, you're putting your body in stress, your heart rate's going up, your body temperature's going up. Your body's adjusting to what you're asking it to do, either via the exercise or by the environment it finds itself in. So stress itself is not a bad thing, but the problem we have is we live in a world where we're constantly slightly in our stress response, constantly slightly in our sympathetic nervous system. So I call it, if you think of it like a car, it's like having your car always in first gear.
Right.
It's not good for the engine. And you kind of need, a fifth gear event sometimes good. Something that really scares you is actually quite a good thing. Really gets that nervous system exploded the way it was designed to be. So the problem that we have is that people don't seem to have an understanding of how they can come out of that sympathetic nervous system. And breath work is the key to that. The way that we breathe is the only thing that we can immediately have a control over, which has a part in all of that sympathetic, parasympathetic activity. So the easiest and most simplest breathwork technique, and it's such an effective way, is to double your exhalation from your inhalation. So breathe in for 5 seconds through the nose under control, and then breathe out slowly for 10 seconds through the mouth, which gives you a 15-second loop. That gives you 4 breaths per minute. And most people, when they're in their stress response, are breathing 12, 13 or 14 respiratory breaths per minute. So slowing it down to 4, especially with the double exhalation, there's kind of a load of science in there around the vagus nerve, the exhalation, slowing that down, doubling that with your inhalation. If you were to do that for 5 to 10 minutes, listen to some relaxing music, you would take your nervous system out of its sympathetic state into parasympathetic, and in effect, out of your stress response.
My gosh, that is amazing. I love that it's just like something somebody can take away and implement, because ultimately I think a lot of it is just getting ourselves out of a state, isn't it, to think clearly. Unfortunately, Phil, we've come to the end of our time together. I think we could carry on talking about this for a really long time, but just before we go, and this has been fantastic, I think there's so much stuff on there that business owners can just take away and implement. If anybody wanted to find out more about you, or how you help and what you deliver, where is the best place to go?
Yeah, so the corporate work that we do, which is obviously around leadership, resilience, culture, and high performance, is limitlessgroup.im. And the Ether Principle, which is, we've launched now, we've got a website, we've run our first course in Ibiza, is etherprinciple.com. And both of those are on social media across those handles as well.
Awesome. That was really fantastic. Thank you so much for today, Phil.
Thank you very much.